Sometimes, the smallest test reveals the biggest truth. Those were the words whispered through the polished conference room only hours after billionaire William Carter shocked everyone who expected to inherit his fortune. His attorney, a silver-haired man who had represented 3 generations of the Carter family, slowly removed a thick envelope from a black leather briefcase and placed it on the walnut table with unusual care. Around him sat executives who had spent decades earning William's trust, relatives who believed they already knew the contents of his estate, and advisors who had helped build one of America's largest investment empires. They expected another routine review of legal documents. Instead, the attorney quietly adjusted his glasses and said, "Mr. Carter rewrote his entire will yesterday evening." Silence settled over the room so completely that the faint ticking of an antique grandfather clock became impossible to ignore. Faces turned pale. Confused glances passed from one side of the table to the other. William Carter was known for making bold business decisions, but never impulsive personal ones. For 40 years, he had measured every investment, every partnership, and every relationship with almost mathematical precision. People often described him as brilliant, disciplined, and impossible to surprise. At 68, he owned skyscrapers, manufacturing companies, technology firms, and charitable foundations spread across the country. Yet the people closest to him knew another side of the billionaire, one hidden beneath tailored suits and calm speeches. William trusted almost no one anymore. Years of betrayal had taught him that appearances were inexpensive, while character carried a price few were willing to pay. That was why he had developed a habit no newspaper had ever uncovered. Whenever he met someone new, especially someone who had nothing, he quietly created a simple test. Never a dramatic one, never cruel, just small moments that revealed how a person responded when dignity was placed beside disappointment. Some failed without realizing they had been examined. Others passed without ever knowing a test had existed. The attorney looked around the room before continuing. His final amendment was inspired by someone he met during dinner. Murmurs immediately filled the air. A business rival? A senator? A renowned philanthropist? None of the guesses came close. The attorney paused just long enough for curiosity to grow before adding, "She was a waitress." Several family members exchanged skeptical smiles. One executive actually laughed under his breath, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. William Carter had negotiated billion-dollar mergers with presidents, royalty, and global investors. The idea that a single dinner server could influence the future of his fortune sounded almost absurd. But the attorney simply slid one handwritten note onto the table. At the bottom, William had written only one sentence. "For the first time in 20 years, someone answered my test instead of my money." 24 hours earlier, as the sun disappeared behind the Manhattan skyline and golden reflections shimmered across the restaurant windows, William Carter quietly folded a $5 bill, placed it beside an expensive dinner receipt, leaned back in his chair, and prepared to discover who the young waitress truly was. William Carter had built an empire by believing that every decision revealed character. Markets rose and fell. Companies succeeded or disappeared. Technology changed every year. Human nature, however, rarely surprised him anymore. That belief had become both his greatest strength and his quietest burden. As the evening crowd filled Lauron House, one of Manhattan's most respected restaurants, conversations floated beneath crystal chandeliers while soft piano music blended with the gentle rhythm of polished silver against fine china. Waiters moved with practiced precision between tables where politicians, celebrities, and business leaders discussed opportunities worth millions of dollars. William noticed none of it. His attention settled on a single name printed neatly on the bottom of his receipt. Claire Bennett, 27 years old, although he did not know that yet. She carried herself differently from the others. Never rushed, never theatrical. She greeted every guest with the same calm smile whether they ordered sparkling water or a bottle of vintage wine worth several $1,000s. She listened before speaking. She thanked every customer without sounding rehearsed. More importantly, she never looked impressed by expensive watches, tailored suits, or famous names. That alone caught William's attention. Over the years, he had watched strangers change the moment they recognized his face. Some became overly friendly. Others became nervous. A few immediately searched for ways to impress him. Claire had done none of those things. She simply asked, "Good evening, sir. May I begin with still water or sparkling?" Her voice was warm without being familiar, confident without being rehearsed. William answered with sparkling water and continued studying the menu while quietly studying her at the same time. She wrote each order in careful handwriting instead of relying on memory to appear clever. She thanked him after every request, even when he changed his side dish twice. She noticed his empty water glass before he did, yet never interrupted an important phone call. Small details, ordinary details, the kind that most people overlooked. William never overlooked small things. They often carried the greatest truth. Across the dining room, another server accidentally dropped a spoon. The brief metallic sound echoed across the marble floor. Several guests frowned. Claire glanced toward her coworker, offered an encouraging smile, then continued serving her own tables without drawing attention to the mistake. No irritation crossed her face. No judgment. Only quiet professionalism. William folded his hands together beneath the table. Interesting, he thought. Very interesting. His assistant often joked that he could evaluate a business proposal within 3 minutes. William secretly believed character could be measured even faster. As dessert menus arrived, he had already made his decision. Tonight would not be about the meal. It would become another one of his private examinations. One simple moment. One small disappointment. $5 placed beside a receipt that totaled nearly $400 after tax. Not enough to start an argument. Just enough to expose expectations. He removed a crisp $5 bill from his wallet and laid it carefully beside the leather folder before quietly closing it. Then he remained seated instead of leaving, his expression calm, his eyes fixed on the dining room entrance where Claire would soon return to collect the check. Few people ever realized that the true test never began with the money. It always began with what happened immediately after. Claire Bennett approached the table with the same quiet composure she had shown every guest that evening. The dining room had grown busier during the past 20 minutes. Glasses caught the warm glow of the chandeliers. Low conversations drifted through the room like distant waves. Somewhere near the entrance, a pianist eased into another familiar melody, almost disappearing beneath the gentle sound of silverware against porcelain. Claire noticed the leather check presenter before she noticed the man was still seated. Most guests had already stood by then. William Carter remained exactly where he had been, hands folded comfortably, watching the city lights shimmer beyond the tall windows. There was nothing impatient about him, nothing rushed. He looked like someone waiting for one final answer that had nothing to do with dinner. Claire offered her usual professional smile and lifted the check presenter with both hands. Inside rested a receipt for $392.40 after tax, along with a neatly folded $5 bill. For the briefest moment, her eyes paused on the amount. Not because she felt disappointed, simply because she understood what it meant. Years in hospitality had taught her that money often carried messages words never expressed. Some people tipped generously because they were grateful. Others tipped generously because they wanted to be admired. Some left almost nothing because they were unhappy. And every so often, someone left an amount so carefully chosen that it felt less like payment and more like a question. Claire quietly closed the folder without changing her expression. Around her, two nearby servers exchanged quick glances. One of them had recognized William Carter the moment he entered. They both knew his reputation for extraordinary generosity at charity events. $5 from a billionaire looked almost unbelievable. One server subtly shook his head in sympathy. Another whispered, "That cannot be right." Claire simply thanked them with a small smile and continued exactly as she always did. She walked to the service station, entered the payment into the register, placed the receipt inside the evening envelope, then returned with calm, unhurried steps. William noticed every movement. No dramatic sigh, no frustrated glance, no attempt to attract attention from coworkers. She carried herself exactly the same as before. That was unusual. Most people revealed disappointment long before they spoke. Claire stopped beside the table and gently placed the receipt where he could reach it. "Thank you for dining with us this evening, Mr. Carter. I hope everything was prepared the way you requested." William looked directly into her eyes, searching for even the smallest crack in her composure. Instead, he found quiet confidence. He nodded once, but did not reach for his coat. The moment stretched between them, long enough for curiosity to replace routine. Finally, he spoke in an even voice. Tell me something, Miss Bennet. If you believed a guest had underestimated your work, what would you say? Several nearby conversations faded into the background. Claire lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat before looking back at him. Her expression remained warm, thoughtful, almost unexpectedly peaceful. She understood then that the $5 had never been the real subject of the evening. It was only the opening sentence of a conversation that had been waiting to happen. Claire held William Carter's gaze for a quiet moment, not because she was searching for the perfect answer, but because she believed important questions deserved an honest pause before honest words. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm. A server carefully uncorked a bottle of California Cabernet for another table. Soft laughter drifted from a birthday celebration near the windows. The pianist moved seamlessly into another gentle melody. Life continued as though nothing unusual was happening. Yet at table 12, something invisible had shifted. William leaned back slightly, studying the young woman standing before him. Most people rushed to defend themselves the moment they sensed judgment. Others apologized before they even knew whether they had done anything wrong. Claire did neither. She simply rested one hand lightly against the leather receipt folder and answered with the same calm voice she had used all evening. If I believed someone underestimated my work, I would probably ask myself why that mattered so much to me. William raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You would not be offended? Claire smiled softly. Everyone sees the world through experiences I know nothing about. Some people have been disappointed so many times that trust becomes expensive. Others have been treated so unfairly that kindness feels suspicious. I cannot control what someone brings into this restaurant. I can only control what I bring to their table. William remained silent. The answer had not followed the direction he expected. He had anticipated frustration, disappointment, perhaps even polite criticism. Instead, she had quietly redirected the conversation toward responsibility rather than blame. $5 is not a generous tip, he said evenly. No, Claire replied without hesitation. It is not. He waited. She did not continue. Does it not bother you? He finally asked. Claire looked down briefly at the folded bill still resting beside the receipt. It tells me almost nothing about my worth, she said. It tells me only what someone chose to leave behind tonight. William felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over him. During decades of negotiations, thousands of people had tried to impress him with intelligence, confidence, or carefully prepared speeches. Claire sounded different. She was not trying to win anything. She was simply telling the truth as she understood it. She continued, My job is to make people feel welcome for the short time they sit in my section. If I allow one number at the end of the meal to erase every conversation before it, then I have given that number far more power than it deserves. Nearby, one of the managers glanced toward their table, wondering why the billionaire had remained so long after paying his bill. A few guests noticed the conversation as well, though no one could hear the words. William folded his hands together. Suppose, he said carefully, that the $5 were intentional. Suppose someone wanted to measure your reaction. Claire nodded once, almost as though the possibility had crossed her mind already. Then she answered with quiet certainty. Tests reveal two people, Mr. Carter. They reveal the one being tested, but they also reveal the one who designed the test. For the first time that evening, William Carter had no immediate reply. He simply looked at the young waitress as the gentle music filled the silence between them, realizing that the conversation had already become far more valuable than the dinner he had ordered. William Carter remained seated even after the conversation seemed finished. For years he had believed silence belonged to the person with the greatest power. Tonight it belonged to someone who carried a notepad instead of a boardroom agenda. Claire Bennet stood patiently beside the table, never checking her watch, never looking around the dining room to see who might be watching. She simply waited with the quiet confidence of someone who did not fear another question. William finally reached toward the folded $5 bill, lifted it between two fingers, and spoke almost to himself. Do you know how many people have failed this test? Claire answered with gentle honesty. I do not even know what passing would look like. He gave a faint smile. It was small enough that most people would have missed it. Most become defensive. Some become angry. Others suddenly become very polite because they recognize my name. Every reaction tells me something. Claire looked at the bill for only a second before meeting his eyes again. May I ask you something instead? William nodded. After all these years of testing people, have you found what you were looking for? The question settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. William did not answer immediately. He had expected curiosity about his wealth, his companies, perhaps even his reputation. Instead, she had questioned the purpose behind the test itself. He slowly leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. "I was looking for honesty," he admitted. Claire smiled kindly. Honesty cannot grow where people believe they are being graded. William felt those words more than he expected. They carried no accusation, no bitterness, only quiet observation. Claire continued in the same calm voice. When someone feels examined, they stop being themselves. They begin performing for the result they think another person wants. The test changes the person before the answer ever comes. The billionaire looked around the restaurant. Couples laughed together over dessert. Friends celebrated birthdays. An elderly couple quietly shared one slice of cheesecake with 2 forks. None of them knew that a conversation worth far more than any financial negotiation was unfolding only a few feet away. William slowly folded the $5 bill again. "Then tell me this, Miss Bennet. If you knew from the beginning that I intended to test you, what would you have done differently?" Claire answered without hesitation. "Nothing." He looked genuinely surprised. "Why?" She rested her hands comfortably in front of her. "Because if I become a different person every time someone important walks through that door, then I never really know who I am. Wealth deserves respect because someone earned it, but character deserves respect because someone lives it every day." William lowered his eyes to the receipt. The total, the signature, the folded bill suddenly seemed strangely insignificant. Numbers had shaped his entire career. Profit margins, stock prices, net worth, percentages. Yet none of those numbers had ever answered the question quietly forming in his heart. Claire spoke once more before excusing herself. "Money is useful, Mr. Carter. It can build hospitals, schools, and businesses. But it cannot save us from becoming the kind of person who believes every relationship needs a price tag. Sometimes the greatest gift we leave another person is simply allowing them to be seen without asking them to prove their value first." William did not realize he was still holding the $5 bill until long after Claire had quietly walked away, leaving him alone with a thought that refused to leave with her. William Carter remained at the table long after the dinner crowd began to thin. His untouched cup of coffee had grown cold beside the folded $5 bill, yet he barely noticed. Outside, the Manhattan streets shimmered beneath a light spring rain, headlights stretching across the wet pavement like ribbons of gold. Inside the restaurant, chairs quietly disappeared onto empty tables as the staff prepared for closing. Claire continued serving her remaining guests with the same steady kindness she had shown throughout the evening. She laughed gently with an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. She patiently explained dessert options to a young family visiting from Ohio. She thanked every guest exactly the same way, never lingering longer at expensive tables, never shortening conversations with those who ordered less. William found himself watching not what she said, but what she never changed. Then, without warning, another voice echoed through his memory. It was soft, familiar, and impossibly distant. "William, if people only show you kindness because they are afraid of losing something, then you never actually meet who they are." The memory arrived with startling clarity. 23 years earlier, his late wife Eleanor had spoken those words after watching him question a junior employee over a trivial accounting mistake. He remembered dismissing her concern with the confidence of a man who believed discipline solved every problem. Eleanor had smiled sadly that evening before placing her hand over his. "You are very good at measuring performance," she had whispered. "I only hope you never forget that people cannot bloom while standing inside an examination room." He had almost forgotten those words. Years of board meetings, acquisitions, legal battles, and endless responsibility had buried them beneath quarterly reports and financial statements. Yet somehow, tonight, a waitress he had never met before had uncovered them without ever knowing they existed. William slowly closed his eyes. He realized something deeply uncomfortable. Every private test he had designed during the past 2 decades had been built from fear instead of wisdom. Fear of betrayal, fear of manipulation, fear of repeating the loneliness that had settled over his life after Eleanor passed away. He had convinced himself that testing people protected him, but perhaps it had also prevented anyone from approaching him honestly. His phone vibrated against the table. The screen displayed a message from his longtime chief of staff. The board meeting tomorrow has been confirmed. The estate attorneys are also prepared for the annual review. William stared at the message without replying. Annual review. The words suddenly carried a different meaning. For years he had reviewed investments, properties, charitable donations, and succession plans with remarkable precision. Yet he could not remember the last time he had reviewed the assumptions guiding his own heart. Across the dining room, Claire collected a stack of menus before noticing William still sitting alone. She offered him the same warm smile she had given every departing guest that evening, neither expecting nor requesting another conversation. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at having challenged one of the wealthiest men in America. She simply wished him a peaceful evening with the quiet sincerity of someone who believed every person deserved dignity before they deserved admiration. William returned the smile almost instinctively. It felt unfamiliar, lighter somehow. As he reached for his coat, one thought settled into his mind with surprising certainty. He had entered the restaurant intending to measure another person's character. Instead, for the first time in many years, he had begun measuring his own. The following morning, the skyline outside William Carter's office appeared as sharp and orderly as every other Tuesday, yet nothing inside him felt familiar. His executive assistant placed the day's schedule on his desk with practiced efficiency. Meetings with investors, a foundation luncheon, an estate planning session with his attorneys. Every hour had been planned weeks in advance. William read the list without absorbing a single word. Instead, his thoughts returned to a quiet voice inside a Manhattan restaurant asking whether years of testing people had ever truly given him what he was searching for. Just before 9 o'clock, his chief of staff, Daniel Brooks, entered carrying a leather portfolio. "Good morning, sir. I also prepared the background report you requested last night." William looked up. "I do not remember requesting one." Daniel hesitated. "I assumed you would. Usually after someone attracts your attention, you ask for a complete investigation before breakfast." William remained silent for a moment before gently closing the folder without opening it. "Not today." Daniel blinked, surprised. In 12 years of working together, he had never heard those words. William stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown. "Tell me something, Daniel. Have you ever noticed how quickly people become files instead of human beings?" Daniel smiled politely, uncertain whether the question required an answer. William continued before he could respond. "I know her full name. I know where she works. That is enough for now. If I want to understand someone, I should not begin by reading what strangers wrote about her." Daniel quietly removed the unopened folder from the desk. It was a small decision, almost invisible, yet it marked the first time William had chosen curiosity over control. Later that afternoon, however, coincidence accomplished what investigation never could. After leaving a meeting several blocks from the restaurant, William asked his driver to take an unfamiliar route back to the office. Traffic slowed near a neighborhood community center tucked between a public library and an old brick church. Through the passenger window, William noticed a familiar figure carrying 2 large boxes toward the entrance. It was Claire. She was no longer wearing the elegant black uniform from the restaurant. Instead, she wore blue jeans, white sneakers, and a simple gray sweater with rolled sleeves. No cameras followed her. No reporters waited nearby. No social media photographer documented the moment. Curious, William asked the driver to park across the street for just a few minutes. From a respectful distance, he watched volunteers greet Claire with genuine warmth. She laughed as children rushed to help carry the boxes inside. An elderly man struggled to lift a folding table, and before anyone asked, Claire quietly crossed the room and helped him without interrupting their conversation. She disappeared into the kitchen, then emerged wearing an apron almost identical to the one she wore at the restaurant. For the next hour, she served hot meals, poured coffee, listened to stories, and remembered names. She moved through the room exactly as she had moved through Laurent House the night before. The same patient smile, the same steady attention, the same quiet dignity. William realized with unexpected humility that she had not been performing for wealthy guests. She had simply been herself. Standing beside the car, he felt something inside him shift once again. Character, he finally understood, was not revealed by how people behaved during a test. It was revealed by how consistently they treated others when they believed nobody important was watching. The estate conference room had witnessed some of the most important decisions in William Carter's career. Billion-dollar acquisitions had begun there. Charitable foundations had been established there. Entire companies had changed direction because of conversations around its polished oak table. Yet on this particular afternoon, the atmosphere felt different. There were no presentation screens glowing with financial projections. No investment bankers waiting with polished speeches. Only William, his longtime attorney Harold Simmons, and 3 thick binders containing the future of one of America's largest private fortunes. Harold adjusted his reading glasses and opened the first binder. We are prepared to finalize the annual review exactly as discussed last year. William remained quiet for several seconds before slowly shaking his head. No, he said calmly. We are going to begin again. Harold looked up in surprise. During nearly 30 years of working together, William had modified percentages, added charitable gifts, and updated beneficiaries, but he had never discarded the entire framework. Has something significant changed? The attorney asked carefully. William turned toward the large window overlooking the city below. Thousands of people moved through the streets, each carrying responsibilities invisible to everyone around them. The view reminded him of the restaurant, of the community center, and of one woman who had unknowingly challenged a belief he had carried for decades. Yes, he answered quietly. I have. Harold waited patiently. He had learned long ago that William never rushed important words. For years I believed my wealth should reward the people closest to me, William continued. Then I convinced myself it should reward the people who proved themselves worthy. I spent years creating tests because I believed trust had to be earned through examination. I was wrong. Harold slowly closed the binder. What changed your mind? William smiled almost imperceptibly. Someone reminded me that character is not measured by how people perform under suspicion. It is revealed by how they live when nobody is keeping score. The attorney nodded thoughtfully. William returned to the table and rested both hands on the polished wood. Rewrite the family trust. Increase the endowment for the scholarship foundation. Expand the community meal program. Establish a hospitality education fund for students working their way through college. Create grants for neighborhood organizations that serve quietly without publicity. I want this fortune to become an opportunity, not a reward. Harold wrote steadily, pausing only once to ask for clarification. Should we mention the individual who inspired these changes? William looked down at the folded $5 bill resting inside his wallet. He had carried it with him since leaving the restaurant. It no longer represented a test. It represented a lesson. No, he answered gently. She did not do what she did to receive recognition. Let her kindness remain exactly as she intended it. The meeting continued for hours as pages were revised, signatures prepared, and decades of assumptions quietly replaced by a different vision of legacy. When everything had finally been completed, Harold slid the final document across the table. William signed his name with slow, deliberate strokes before adding one handwritten note on a separate sheet addressed only to his attorney. It read, If anyone ever asks why I changed my will, tell them I finally met someone who reminded me that the greatest inheritance is not money. It is the example we leave behind for people we may never meet. Several months passed, and Manhattan settled into another season without noticing that one quiet dinner had altered the course of a fortune worth billions. Newspapers reported that William Carter had expanded educational grants, increased funding for community meal programs, and restructured his charitable foundation to support organizations serving ordinary families across the country. Financial analysts praised the changes as visionary. Business magazines called them a surprising shift in legacy planning. Commentators searched for hidden corporate strategies behind every decision. None of them knew the truth. The explanation had never appeared in a press release because it had never been about public image. It had begun with a simple conversation between two strangers who would probably never meet under the same circumstances again. Claire Bennett knew nothing about the legal meetings or the rewritten documents. Her life continued much as it always had. Every evening, she tied the same black apron around her waist, greeted guests with the same calm smile, and treated every table with equal respect whether the bill totaled $30 or $500. She still volunteered at the community center on her days off. She still remembered the names of elderly guests who returned every week for coffee and homemade pie. She still believed that kindness was most valuable when nobody expected applause. One rainy Thursday evening, just before the dinner rush began, the front door opened and an elderly gentleman stepped inside carrying a folded umbrella. His suit was neat but modest, his silver hair carefully combed, and his gentle smile reminded Claire of someone who had spent a lifetime listening more than speaking. She welcomed him as she welcomed everyone else and guided him to a quiet table near the window. He ordered a bowl of soup, grilled salmon, and hot tea. Throughout the meal, he asked about the restaurant, complimented the staff, and thanked Claire each time she refilled his cup. Nothing about the evening seemed extraordinary. When he finished dinner, he paid the check, wished everyone a pleasant evening, and quietly walked toward the exit. As Claire cleared the table, she noticed a familiar sight resting beside the receipt, a neatly folded $5 bill. For just a moment, she smiled to herself. Beneath it rested a sealed white envelope with her name written carefully across the front. She opened it only after her shift ended. Inside was a single handwritten card. There was no signature, no company logo, only a short message written in steady blue ink. Years ago, someone taught me that people should never have to earn the dignity they already possess. Because of that lesson, thousands of strangers will receive opportunities they may never know were made possible by one quiet conversation. Thank you for answering a question that money never could. Claire read the note twice before gently folding it back into the envelope. She never tried to discover who had written it. Somehow, she already knew that was not the important part. She slipped the envelope into her bag, turned off the dining room lights with the last server, and stepped into the cool Manhattan evening where the city continued rushing toward tomorrow. Behind her, the restaurant grew quiet once again. Ahead of her, ordinary life waited exactly as it always had. And perhaps that was the greatest ending of all. Some people change the world by standing on stages where everyone can see them. Others change it while carrying plates, pouring coffee, and choosing grace when nobody is keeping score. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary.